This is my short list, but this short list could still be a wish list for somebody else. Vigorous Steve here. Let's discuss 5 performance-enhancing drugs I've used in the past, but vouched to never ever use again. So this is my personal PEDiKHAD list, the performance-enhancing drugs I have known and disliked. I won't say hated, because I'm sure there's somebody out there who still enjoys taking some of the performance-enhancing drugs, which we'll discuss on this list. But I certainly didn't love them either. I mean, I got a ton of side effects, or I didn't get the effects which I expected from using these particular performance-enhancing drugs. So we'll discuss all of that in this video. Before we get into it, please like the video, leave a comment for the algorithm, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. And keep in mind, guys, this is just my opinion, reasons why I don't want to take them ever again. I've experimented with all of these compounds in the past. This is my short shit list, but this short shit list could still be a wish list for somebody else. Let's start off with 2,4-dinitrophenol, also known as DNP. I first experimented with DNP in 2012, almost 10 years ago, after weeks and weeks of research on the steroid forums, researching on PubMed regarding the potential for cataracts, which was investigated in women in the 50s or 60s, I believe. I looked into the pharmacodynamics. I looked into how DNP was used as a fertilizer or as an explosive. I read all the anecdotal reports, the DNP trip reports, so to say, right? Which side effects people were experiencing, how they were able to mitigate that, which antioxidants they put into place, how they structured their diets. I read all of it. All of it. I researched for weeks because I was interested in running the most potent fat burner known to man. Big mistake. I ran 200 milligrams for 2 days to assess tolerance. And then I increased to 400 milligrams spaced out over 2 dosages, 200 milligrams in the morning and another 200 milligrams in the afternoon. I had my fan ready. I had my diet ready with a ton of antioxidants to prevent oxidative stress. This was in the winter, mind you. It was minus 5 degrees outside. This was in the dead middle of December. I was sleeping with my door open. It was minus 5 degrees outside. I slept under a very thin blanket, and I would still overheat. And I would drench my bed in sweat. It was horrible. It was horrible. I could not really get a good night's sleep. And the problem with DNP is that it's still active. It's still active for a couple of days in your system. So even though I discontinued the DNP at day 4, because I found that the side effects were too severe, it still remained active in my system for almost a week. And during that time, water retention would just build up and build up and build up to the point I got a little bit of edema in my ankles, which made me feel very, very uncomfortable considering I was eating incredibly clean foods. Now, during those couple of days, I was drinking a ton of water because you're supposed to stay hydrated while using DNP, making sure you stay on top of your electrolyte intake because, well, DNP is a mitochondrial uncoupler, changing how the mitochondrial functions and disposes a lot of the energy production as heat instead of producing ATP directly. So I was really on top of my water intake to keep the body temperature down and make sure that I sweat adequately to regulate my body temperature and make sure I get sufficient amount of electrolytes so I don't manipulate the proton pump ion exchange within the ATP cycle that much beyond the use of DNP, right? You don't want to get into an electrolyte deficient state while you're using DNP. Right? This is all the research that I've done 10 years ago on the message boards. I'm sure a lot of things have changed since then, but that's what I remember doing at that time. So I was drinking a ton of water, staying on top of my electrolyte intake. I'm sure that contributed to some of the edema, which I experienced after discontinuing the DNP after 4 days. But while I was using it, I had to go to the bathroom so much, especially at night, right? Probably burning through the glycogen in the middle of the night because, again, your metabolic rate and the uncoupling effect that the DNP has, disposing a lot of the energy as heat, you're simply burning through calories. So I had to go pee 7 times a night. More than 700 milligrams of mastrone per day, right? That makes you pee like a maniac too. On DNP, I was peeing the exact same amount, even though I was not running mastrone at the time. I was just running 250 milligrams a test, if I remember correctly. It was not certainly not on an astronomical cycle. So I had to go to the bathroom many a times while using DMP and a couple of days after discontinuing the DMP. And every time I would go from this freezing room with a soaked mattress and pillow and bed sheets, I would go to the toilet and pee my brains out and then go back to bed. My bed would be frozen. Really? Insane, dude. I would go back to my bed and I would shiver like this in my bed because it was frozen in the time that I went to the bathroom, sweating through the blankets previously. And of course, the cold air that was coming from outside just to keep my body temperature down would completely freeze my bed over in a matter of a minute or two that I was in the bathroom. So multiple times per night, I had to go pee my brains out and then heat up the bed, which usually occurred within 5 minutes or so. Then the bed would be hot again. Of course, it would be clammy and damp, and I would start to sweat again. Really, a horrible experience. Now, to be fair, when all the water dissipated, I did lose a decent amount of body fat. But when I did my blood work, I saw that my creatinine was sky high. Sky high. And a lot of the other markers on my blood work were sky high as well. Now, I did not have access to such extensive blood work as I do right now here in Thailand. I mean, I can walk in and just do whatever test they have available as long as I pay out of pocket. And in Holland, it's a little bit more difficult. You have to go through your primary healthcare provider and request a ton of tests, and then they won't provide a lot of tests that you asked for. Plus, I was not as knowledgeable about blood work as I am right now. So I didn't test as many markers, but I do remember, unfortunately, those results are in Holland and in Dutch. So I have no idea where they are. I asked my mom many times to get me the previous blood work results, which are printouts. But I do remember that my creatinine was like way too high and my liver enzymes were way too high. So I was not too pleased with seeing those results. So I decided to throw the remainder of the DNP in the trash. Now, what I do nowadays, after doing a lot more research and understanding the pharmacodynamics of much less invasive fat burners like GW1516, SR9009, 5-amino-1-MQ, which I'm trialing right now. And honestly, I would rather consider a higher dose clenbuterol or yohimbine or ephedrine. Not in Asia, that's a legal situation waiting to happen. But in other parts of the world, ephedrine is still available over the counter. There's so many more suitable fat burners that you can run concurrently with a lot less side effects and similar outcomes regarding fat loss, if not better. Especially when combined with fasting, which is superior over DNP in any way, shape, or form. You just need to have a little bit more character and perseverance and some cojones to make that fast happen. Because it's easy to take DNP and sit there in a fan just sweating your balls off. And it's certainly a lot more difficult to sit at home, patiently waiting for the clock to come down 132 hours later before you can eat again. And you can still do a fasting mimicking diet, for example, stay on top of your micronutrient intake, your water intake, right? You can manipulate the fast in a way that it's a lot more easier and doesn't take away from productivity. That's why I posted a video not too long ago where you do fasting, or where I did fasting combined with a fasting mimicking diet. So the caloric intake is overall quite low. And then particular performance-enhancing drugs dosed at the right times to speed up fat loss without sacrificing glycogen. You can see that from the before and after pictures. I look very similar, but unfortunately, the fat loss doesn't really translate well to the picture. So even though the muscle fullness is almost identical, especially amazing considering I didn't eat for 5 days. I mean, let that sink in. I didn't eat for 5.5 days and I looked just as full. The fat loss was not that apparent because I was fat in the first picture. And the second picture, the fat went away, albeit not as dramatic as the upcoming fast, which I'll do in a couple of weeks from now. But right from what I saw in the mirror, the fat was literally falling off of me. And you get the same effect with DMP, albeit that the side effects you'll experience and the changes in blood work, man, horrendous. Horrendous. Completely not worth it. I would rather fast and really do a true fast with no pharmacology involved, which I will do soon at your guys' request. I would rather go flat and starve while fasting than use DMP ever again, because fasting improves my blood work and DMP made it look horrendous. Let's move over to the second compound I'll never use again, and it's Trenbolone. And that's mostly on my wife's request, because she noticed that I was not a very pleasant person to be around when using Trenbolone. Now, I always get great results from using Trenbolone. The last time I used it was 2015, I believe, or 2014. And then my wife asked me, said, hey, right, your mood, you're intolerable regarding the little bitching that you're doing all day about trivial things. So maybe it's time to come off, right? So the quality of our relationship can be leveled up a little bit more. So I came off, and 3 weeks later, I completely realized how much of a douchebag I was while running Tren. Now again, I still recommend Tren to clients, only the ones that compete. I'm not really for using Trenbolone in the off season unless you're really, really, really developed. Well, let's be honest, most guys don't even reach that point of development where Trenbolone is required during the off season to really excel regarding muscularity and strength and overall volumization, and keep themselves a little bit leaner, because it does have an effect on nutrient partitioning over the other anabolic androgenic steroids that we can choose from. I mean, there's a million other drug combinations out there that will yield very comparable results as using Trenbolone, albeit maybe at a more expensive rate, with less negative effects on your mood, on your blood work, no known issues of kidney stress, no real changes regarding your blood pressure, right? No personality issues. And besides the anger management issues, there's personality changes which occur on Trenbolone. And not everybody suffers from this. I mean, I know several people who are on Trenbolone are happy-go-lucky. I mean, I'm jealous, to be honest, because if I was happy-go-lucky, I would consider to sprinkle in 50 milligrams of Trenbolone here and there. Not anymore. I have no aspirations to be big, but maybe in the past, when I was trying to get up to 120 kilos, I would have run maybe 50 milligrams, 80 milligrams, 100 milligrams of Trenbolone acetate per week if I could deal with the side effects that are severe personality changes and anger management issues. But I couldn't. So my wife asked me to stop, and I obliged happily, right? And now I'm a much better person without the Trenbolone in my system. And, well, I got up to 115 kilos without it. So now desiring to be 100 kilos, I can accomplish a comparable look with testosterone and Primobolan, albeit it's maybe not as nasty, hard, and dense. I know Trenbolone was heavily popularized on the steroid boards from guys hiding behind anonymity, making all sorts of claims that Trenbolone can change your genetics and will turn you into a freak. And it'll make you go pro, and it's the missing ingredient, right? Nectar of the gods. Ugh. Man, I feel stupid for being such a gullible mid-20-year-old bodybuilder. I wish I never took it. Now, even though I have the experience with Trenbolone that I'm able to recommend safer practices to my clients, really, I've put so many guys on stage now in a combination of testosterone and Primo. And then at the end, you throw in the halotestin. So you don't have this 8-week trajectory that you feel absolutely horrible and anger management issues and mood changes. And that's not present, only the last 2 weeks. So that's 8 weeks of acting like a douchebag versus 2 weeks of acting like a douchebag. And well, on halotestin, you're enraged 24/7 in all the wrong ways. But that's 2 weeks versus 8 weeks, right? So you're moderately enraged for 8 weeks on Trenbolone leading into a contest, or only 2 weeks. And of course, if you combine Tren with halotestin, I hope you have a very patient partner. And my wife is very patient, but not patient enough to tolerate me on Trenbolone. So going forward, besides a testosterone base, I think the only injectable I would actually consider is Primobolan, and then maybe Anavar as the only oral out of all the choices that we have access to nowadays. Test, Primo, Anavar. That's it. Let's move over to Cabergoline, which I tried recently. I used that in the past when I did the Nandrolone only cycle. I did not experience any severe prolactin issues when I did the Nandrolone only cycle, because again, prolactin raises in the presence of high progesterone and high estrogen, or moderately elevated estradiol and moderately elevated progesterone, or a progesterogenic 90 NOR, derivative like nandrolone or Trenbolone or Trestolone. So when I did the nandrolone only cycle, my estradiol levels were 12 or 13 picograms per milliliter. So I did not see a tremendous increase in prolactin levels. I did use it at the time just to experiment, see how far my prolactin would come down by the use of Cabergoline. Now, that's actually a horrible combination because nandrolone has been associated with left ventricular hypertrophy, and Cabergoline has also been associated with left ventricular hypertrophy. And when you do the research, basically every steroid has been associated with left ventricular hypertrophy, besides boldenone, I believe, but maybe that's never been examined directly. But even Primobolan has been associated with left ventricular hypertrophy. So keep it in mind, steroids and left ventricular hypertrophy almost go hand in hand unless you are proactive with beta blockers or blood pressure medications or ubiquinol, taurine, electrolyte intake, right? All the things to support your heart, which I was doing at that time. Now, what I did experience, I did not experience any increase in blood pressure, right? I was also on top of that using tadalafil every day. What I mostly noticed from Cabergoline, also recently after a single dose of 0.25 milligrams, which was for off-label use, I'll explain that later, is heart palpitations. Uncomfortable heart palpitations for 2 days. So when I did the nandrolone only cycle and ran 0.25 milligrams Cabergoline twice per week, so that's half a milligram per week, I would just get these heart palpitations. So I ran that for maybe 2 or 3 weeks at the end of the nandrolone only cycle. And then, well, stupidly enough, I persisted. So I get this uncomfortable feeling, this heart palpitations, which is not really a high heart rate, but it's simply a more forceful contraction, probably because, Cabergoline is a dopamine receptor agonist, and antagonizing the dopamine receptors of the heart led to a more forceful, more pronounced contraction. Again, scary. So I persisted. I did my blood work. I saw that my prolactin was undetectable. I discontinued the Cabergoline and I discontinued the nandrolone. Never touched it again until a couple weeks ago when I wanted to use Cabergoline for, reduced refractory period. I wanted to have a shortened duration between orgasms. You guys can imagine. So now I'm not going to get into details, but in that sense, it was productive. 0.25 milligrams Cabergoline in a single dose the morning of leaving to the hotel was effective to have a very enjoyable weekend. But again, I went to bed and this forceful contraction of my heart returned. And I have not experienced that since doing the nandrolone only cycle and the last time I used Cabergoline. I believe I also used Cabergoline on a couple Tren cycles at pretty low dosages where I did not experience this side effect. But with later use, as I get older, I certainly notice heart palpitations and it doesn't feel too comfortable in any way, shape, or form. So, again, I bought some Pfizer Cabergoline. Luckily, at only 14 or 15 tablets of half a milligram. Pricey, right? Pharmaceutical grade Cabergoline is not cheap. I used a half tablet, and the rest went down the trash. I don't want to ever use that again because the effects regarding this off-label use of having a shortened duration between consecutive orgasms is beneficial, but it's not worth feeling horrible palpitations in my heart for 2 days, 3 days, while Cabergoline is metabolizing and continues to stimulate the dopamine receptors of the heart. And of course, in the brain, I'm sure my prolactin levels were undetectable for a while. And listen, there's many different ways to lower your prolactin, right? You can avoid the progestogenic 19-nors. You can avoid Trenbolone. You can avoid nandrolone. You can avoid Trestolone. You don't have to take it. There are a lot of other anabolic steroids out there which will yield comparable results as Tren, nandrolone, and Trestolone, right? Or you might have to do a little bit more funky drug combination to get comparable effects. If you discontinue the weed or you discontinue the kratom, which are both associated with elevated prolactin levels, you also don't need to use Cabergoline. And a combination of Tren and weeds, or nandrolone and kratom, or a mixed match of all of these, I mean, that's prolactin heaven, basically. And of course, if you add in anadrol on top, that might even make it worse and then result in cascade into gynecomastia. So I think the key for everybody here is to avoid wheat and kratom to prevent occasional increases in prolactin levels. Make sure your estradiol is in range. Make sure your progesterone is normal. Ideally, you avoid progestogenic 19-nors, which, again, maybe during a contest prep, it might be difficult to avoid if you want to show up freaky huge, because then, well, trend is pretty much a given. But even then, during that time, if you keep your estrogen reasonably low, since prolactin is secreted in combination of estradiol and progesterone or a progestogenic 19-nor derivative, in most cases, on a trend cycle with the base dose of testosterone, I don't really see prolactin to come up over the reference range unless, well, wheat or kratom is chronically abused to take the edge off the Trenbolone, right? So might be better just to go with Primobolan, as do I. Then you don't need Caber or wheat or kratom. So keep all of that in mind. There's much better ways out there to approach cycle design, because the use of one drug might cascade into the use of another drug, which then needs another drug to mitigate all these side effects. Keep that in mind, guys. I mean, we're looking for the most sustainable approach, and even off-label Cabergoline use, even though I know it's popular. I mean, I do consultations with guys here and there who contact me for the best PE stack. That's the penis enhancement, not the performance enhancement. Well, that's performance enhancing, true. But, right, many different ways to use these pharmacological interventions. And they use Cabergoline as well. And then they have a great session or three, right, consecutively. And then they notice these heart palpitations as well. And of course, with prolonged use, especially at higher dosages, left ventricular hypertrophy might manifest. Now, luckily for me, after all the mistakes that I've made regarding Trenbolone, regarding Cabergoline, regarding periods of high blood pressure, I have no left ventricular hypertrophy. I don't even have an athlete's heart. But that's me. That might not be you. So prevention is probably the best cure. And of course, when you have LVH, you need to put more things into practice to potentially reverse that. Next on the list, Phentermine and Subitramine. I experimented with both way back when in Holland as an appetite suppressant. And nowadays we have much more suitable appetite suppressants out there, whether those are stimulatory or mimic natural pathways like the GLP-1 receptor agonist, for example. Phentermine is an FDA-approved drug in the United States where it's prescribed as a weight loss drug. It's a substituted amphetamine, which means it shows up on a 5-panel drug test. And because of that, it's very risky to take in particular parts of the world where amphetamine use is highly frowned upon. So when I did use it, it was back in Holland, because at the time I wanted to see how much of a beneficial effect I could get from Phentermine over clenbuterol regarding appetite suppression and the overall effects of fat burning. Now, I got good results from clenbuterol at my first cycle, which I used clenbuterol for pretty much the end of it, the last couple of weeks. And I noticed a decent amount of fat loss, but I was getting increasingly hungry, even more hungry than before I did diets drug-free. So I wanted to see if Phentermine would offer additional appetite suppression, making the diet a little bit easier. Now, Phentermine primarily acts as a norepinephrine releasing agent, and it also changes the dopamine and serotonergic system in the brain. You get a little bit of fat loss from increased norepinephrine concentrations in the body, resulting in lipolysis. So I wanted to see if that was be comparable to clenbuterol, which it isn't, and if the appetite suppressant effect of Phentermine was superior than that of clenbuterol, which many people actually notice that they get hungrier while using clen. Now, having experimented with recreational drugs in my younger years, late teens, early 20s, again, when I was in Holland and only Holland, having gone through that phase of my life, T-col and P-col indeed, then when I took Phentermine a little bit later, when I was 29, 28 years old, if I remember correctly, it felt like very cheap recreational drugs. You get all the jittery and the stimulatory effect of particular recreational drugs that are very common in the party scene, or at least at the time, early 2000s. I know I'm dating myself, guys, but this is a long ass time ago that I would dabble in the party scene. And then I took Phentermine, and it immediately reminded me of going to parties 5 years, 7 years prior. So without all the pleasurable, exciting, keeping you up all night dancing effects. So after a couple of days of experimenting with Phentermine, I decided to discontinue it because I didn't want to be reminded of that time. Not that I had a horrible time partying. I mean, I had a great time, but I was trying to focus on my bodybuilding journey. And I really didn't want to use a drug that would be so stimulatory, almost to the point that you would think you're using a recreational drug without all the benefits. And then run that for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks on duration until the diet was completed. So after a couple of days, I decided to discontinue it. That Phentermine went in the trash as well. And then I started researching Subitramine, which is also an appetite suppressant, but it got discontinued in 2010. So that's been pulled off the market. Of course, in the gray area underground lab scene, Subitramine might still be available. I experimented with that maybe 2 weeks after discontinuing the Phentermine. So I ran that for maybe a week in duration, maybe a little bit longer, because I did feel that it was working better for me. But after doing more research and knowing that it increases the risk of cardiovascular events and strokes were associated with Subitramine use. Again, this is with prolonged exposure, maybe a little bit of a misuse, and we don't know what kind of cardiovascular health these people had before they got strokes while using Subitramine, right? But it was too scary for my liking, so I discontinued that as well. And considering all the appetite suppressants which are now on the market, which are far superior, whether those are the cognitive enhancers in the form of modafinil or Adderall, or the true appetite suppressants by mimicking the natural pathway of eating in the form of a GLP-1 receptor agonist, a combination of a low dose of both, low dose modafinil and the GLP-1, no hunger. And there's no need to increase this neurological drive through increasing norepinephrine or dopamine or serotonin, even though modafinil does have a little bit of an overlap in this effect. Now, Subitramine is a monoamine reuptake inhibitor, so it increases norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine concentrations in the brain directly. And this is where they think part of the appetite suppression is coming from. And I also noticed that at that time, people that use Subitramine would get some antidepressant-like effects, not to the extent that proper antidepressants might yield, but some of the users did notice that they were in a slightly better mood. I did not experience that myself when I experimented with Subitramine, and I would say that modafinil is far superior when it comes to appetite suppression, increase in cognition, wakefulness, productivity, and also a little bit of an increase in mood and overall sense of well-being. And then last on the list of performance-enhancing drugs I vouch to never use again are the growth hormone secretagogues. And not because they're inherently bad or get horrible side effects or you don't get your bang for your buck. It's simply that I've been exposed to pharmaceutical-grade growth hormone for almost a decade now. I mean, I discontinued it a couple months ago, so I haven't used it since. I've been experimenting with HGH-Frag. We'll get to that a little bit later. Of all the experiments that I've ran with MK677, GHRP216, CJC1295 with or without DAC, ipamorelin, sermorelin I've used. I haven't used tesamorelin, but I know people that use tesamorelin with moderate results. Like everything that I've seen, I've researched. And all the comparisons I've done with the growth hormone secretagogues, comparing it to true pharmaceutical-grade growth hormone, for me, I would spend an arm and a leg on 1 or 2 units of exogenous pharmaceutical growth hormone over any dose of a growth hormone secretagogue. Now, maybe that's my pituitary being very unresponsive to a growth hormone secretagogue. I was only able to get it maybe to the middle top of the reference range of the growth hormone in the IGF-1 levels. So maybe my pituitary is simply not cooperating or lazy. And as I could tell from my latest blood work, where my LH and FSH levels didn't really seem to go over 3 or 4 milli-IUs per milliliter when I recovered my hypothalamic pituitary adrenal and testes axes. So maybe my pituitary is just lazy. Maybe it's just me. I've seen growth hormone secretagogues work for many people, especially younger people that still are able to produce reasonably high amounts of growth hormone, cascading into high amounts of serum IGF-1 levels. But for me personally, after being exposed to exogenous pharmaceutical growth hormone for almost a decade, I would choose that in a heartbeat over any growth hormone secretagogue. So let's summarize and go over the PEDiKHADs, the performance-enhancing drugs I have known and disliked. DNP, Trenbolone, cascading into ment, dihydroboldenone, and well, let's be honest, most of the other anabolic androgenic steroids that are in test, Primo, or Anavar, I would consider Masteron maybe at one point if I could find a reputable source, which here in Thailand, well, no thanks. Cabergoline and all the other dopamine receptor agonists, I would rather run Modafinil year-round, which also lowers prolactin to a certain extent because it does increase dopamine and serotonergic activity in the brain, lowering prolactin as a result of it. But I'd rather avoid the weed, the kratom, the Trenbolone, the Nandrolone, the Tristolone, and whatever else that could potentially raise prolactin. I'm always in a micronutrient surplus. I'm not vitamin B6 deficient. I haven't had the need to run vitamin B6 P5P in a while because my prolactin is always in range. And maybe that's the modafinil contributing. Phentermine and Subitramine, I will never touch those again, considering all the alternatives which are far superior to reduce appetite and have much better and healthier overlapping effects. And then the growth hormone secretagogues, which from my personal experience, I would just not consider running in the future. Even though plenty of other guys get good experience and good results from growth hormone secretagogues, once you go pharma, it's hard to go back. So I'll leave it at that, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you're looking for the most comprehensive guides to bodybuilding pharmacology, you can find the ebooks on my website, vigorsteve.com/shop. Personalized advice always available through consultations. You can find the rates on my website as well. Follow me on Instagram at vigorsteve. Front double bicep for the Vigorous crew. I hope you guys learned something from this video so you guys can learn from my mistakes and not experience any of these terrible side effects that I did in the past. Albeit that I did run a little experiment with Cabergoline pretty recently, so please learn from that also. I do these experiments so you don't have to. I'll leave it at that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.